Welcome, child, come closer. I want you to close your eyes and imagine yourself sitting in a sacred grove. Feel the soft grass beneath you, still warm from the day's sun, and notice how your shoulders begin to release their tension as crickets begin their evening symphony. Your breathing naturally slows as you settle into this timeless place where worries dissolve like morning mist, and your heart finds the rhythm of something deeper, older, and infinitely peaceful. Come with me, child. Let us enter the magical and timeless realm of mythology. Sit around this fire as humans have done since the dawn of time. Breathe deeply and relax. The flames dance before you, casting golden shadows that seem to tell stories of their own, while the smoke carries your thoughts up toward the stars where the gods themselves once walked among mortals. You may have come here because you cannot sleep. You are restless or thinking about your problems. You are not alone. People have come to my fire to hear stories for a very long time, for many thousands of years, and they will continue to come long after you have gone, and you are all connected. All of them are enchanted by stories that are not just about magical beings, but that speak to our most intimate and internal dramas and challenges. You are in very good company. Now let go of the weight, child. Lock your problems in Pandora's box. Whatever torments you, there is no way to solve it today. What you have to do today is rest well to be prepared for tomorrow. Forget everything and embark on this journey. Also forget that you have to sleep. Just listen and enter my story. I am sure that Hypnos, the god of sleep, will make you fall asleep, and that his son, Morpheus, will give you pleasant dreams. Perhaps the mighty Apollo, who has a habit of sending messages in dreams, will help you with your problems tonight. It is time. Night has fallen outside. Now let night fall within you. I will now tell you the story of Eros and Psyche. Listen closely, for this is a tale that will make your heart flutter like butterfly wings and leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love. It begins in a kingdom where beauty was so extraordinary that it threatened the very gods themselves, and it ends in a place where love transcends even death. Between these moments lies a journey filled with impossible tasks, divine jealousy, betrayal that cuts deeper than any sword, and a love so pure it rewrote the laws of heaven itself. You will meet a young woman whose curiosity nearly destroyed everything she held dear, a god who discovered that even immortal hearts can break, and a goddess whose fury could shake the very foundations of Olympus. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, when three sisters lived in a palace by the sea, and one of them was so beautiful that mortals began to forget the name of Aphrodite herself in ancient times, when the line between the mortal and divine worlds was as thin as spider silk There lived a king whose 3 daughters were renowned throughout the Mediterranean for their beauty. But while the 2 eldest sisters were lovely in the way that poets write about in verses that fade with time, the youngest daughter, Psyche, possessed a beauty so transcendent that it seemed to capture light itself and reflect it back in ways that made mortals weep. Her skin had the luminous quality of pearls found in the deepest parts of the ocean. Her hair flowed like liquid gold touched by Helios himself, and her eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire galaxies of wisdom and innocence combined. Word of Psyche's beauty traveled faster than merchant ships across the wine-dark sea. Pilgrims began arriving at the palace gates, not to worship at the temples of Aphrodite, but simply to catch a glimpse of this mortal girl whose beauty rivaled that of the goddess of love herself. They would stand in the courtyards for hours, bringing offerings of flowers and precious oils, whispering prayers to Psyche as if she were divine. The young woman would walk through these crowds with the grace of a deer stepping through morning dew, her bare feet making no sound on the marble floors, her simple white chiton flowing around her like clouds around a mountain peak. But Psyche herself remained untouched by the adoration, while her sisters reveled in their beauty, using it like a weapon to bend the wills of suitors and win precious gifts. Psyche carried herself with a sadness that seemed to emanate from her very soul. She would stand on her balcony each evening, watching the sunset paint the sea in shades of amber and rose, her fingers absently playing with the golden chain around her neck, a gift from her father. The weight of so much attention, so much expectation, pressed down on her shoulders like an invisible cloak. She longed for someone to see beyond the surface, to love not her face, but the thoughts that moved behind her eyes, the dreams that kept her awake, listening to the night wind dot. As months passed, something troubling began to happen. Her sisters, Egil and Chloe, received proposal after proposal from princes and merchants, powerful men who saw in their beauty a prize worth pursuing. But no one dared approach Psyche. Her beauty had become so legendary, so associated with the divine, that mortal men felt unworthy even to speak her name. They would worship her from afar, but none had the courage to court her. It was as if she had become too sacred to touch, too perfect to possess. King Anatole, Psyche's father, watched this strange phenomenon with growing concern. His youngest daughter, the most beautiful of all his children, was becoming isolated by the very gift that should have brought her happiness. He consulted oracles and wise men, but their answers only deepened his worry. Some spoke of divine jealousy, others of curses that came with beauty too great for mortal flesh to bear. The king found himself lying awake at night, listening to his daughter's footsteps as she paced her chambers, unable to find peace. But there was someone else who was losing sleep over Psyche's beauty. and her awakening was far more dangerous than a father's worry. High on Mount Olympus, where the air was thin and charged with the power of immortality, Aphrodite reclined on her throne of pink marble and white gold. Her perfect features twisted into an expression that would have made seasoned warriors flee in terror. The goddess of love was experiencing an emotion entirely foreign to her divine nature, jealousy. Reports had reached her of mortals abandoning her temples, of prayers once offered to her being whispered instead to a mere human girl. Her priestesses brought her offerings that had dwindled to almost nothing, while stories grew of pilgrims traveling vast distances just to glimpse Psyche's face, the goddess who had inspired the creation of countless works of art, who had been the subject of hymns and sacrifices since the dawn of human civilization, was being replaced in mortal affections by a girl who had not yet seen 20 summers. Aphrodite's rage was not the hot, explosive anger of Ares in battle, nor the cold, calculating fury of Athena when her wisdom was questioned. It was something more dangerous, a slow-burning resentment that grew stronger with each passing day, fed by reports of Psyche's increasing fame. The goddess would pace the crystalline floors of her palace, her sandals clicking like hailstones, her golden hair flowing behind her like a banner of war. She wore a dress of sea-foam green that shifted and changed like ocean waves, and around her throat hung the magical girdle that made all who saw her fall instantly in love. But even this powerful artifact could not soothe the wound to her pride. Other gods watched Aphrodite's growing obsession with a mixture of amusement and concern. Zeus himself, from his throne of clouds and lightning, observed the situation with the detached interest of one who had seen countless such dramas play out over the centuries. He knew that when a goddess felt her power threatened, the consequences could reshape the very fabric of reality. Hera, despite her own complicated relationship with divine jealousy, watched with the sharp eyes of one who understood exactly what Aphrodite was feeling. Even Artemis, who generally disapproved of her sister's dramatic tendencies, found herself drawn to the unfolding drama, like a hunter tracking prey through moonlit forests. It was on a night when the autumn wind howled around the peaks of Olympus that Aphrodite finally decided to act. She summoned her son Eros to her palace with a command that echoed through the divine realms like thunder across mountains. The young god arrived on wings that caught the starlight and reflected it in rainbow patterns, his bow of polished gold slung across his holder, his quiver full of arrows that could make anyone fall in love with the first person they saw. But despite his power over mortal hearts, Eros remained, in many ways, a child playing with forces beyond his complete understanding. "My son," Aphrodite said, her voice carrying the sound of waves breaking against hidden rocks, There's a task I have for you. A mortal girl has dared to rival my beauty, to steal the worship that rightfully belongs to me. Her name is Psyche, and she must be punished for her presumption. Eros listened with the casual attention of someone who had heard such requests countless times before. Mortals were always overreaching, always needing to be reminded of their place in the cosmic order. He examined his arrows with practiced ease, selecting one whose tip gleamed with the particular enchantment needed for his mother's revenge. "What would you have me do, Mother?" he asked, his voice carrying the musical quality that came from being born of divine love itself. Aphrodite's smile was as beautiful and dangerous as a coral reef, hiding beneath crystal clear water. "I want you to make her fall in love with the most hideous, despicable creature you can find. Let her beauty become a curse that binds her to something so repulsive that mortals will understand the price of challenging the gods. Find some monster, some beast so revolting that even his own kind shun him, and ensure that when Psyche first opens her eyes, his face is what she sees." The plan was elegantly cruel in the way that only immortal minds could conceive. Psyche's beauty, which had elevated her to near divine status in mortal eyes, would become the very trap that destroyed her. She would be forced to love someone that her appearance would naturally repel, creating a prison of conflicting desires that would serve as entertainment for the gods and a warning to any other mortals who might dare to compete with divine beauty. Eros accepted his assignment with the dutiful nod of a son who had never questioned his mother's commands. He prepared for his journey to the mortal realm with the methodical precision of a craftsman about to practice his art. His bow was strung with string made from the heartstrings of lovers who had died of passion. His arrows were sharpened to points finer than mortal understanding, and his wings were oiled with ambrosia, so they would make no sound as he flew through the night sky. The young god left Olympus just as the moon was setting, diving through layers of cloud and starlight toward the mortal world below. He flew over cities where lovers met in secret gardens, over forests where wild things hunted by moonlight, over oceans where sirens sang to sailors who would never see home again. The world spread out beneath him like a tapestry woven from dreams and nightmares, and he was the thread that bound them all together as dawn approached. Eros found himself hovering above the palace where Psyche slept. The building was constructed of white marble that seemed to glow with its own inner light, surrounded by gardens where night-blooming flowers released fragrances that could intoxicate even the gods. He could see her chambers on the third floor, where gauze curtains fluttered in the morning breeze like the wings of captured butterflies. But as he prepared to descend and carry out his mother's command, Eros made a decision that would change the course of his immortal existence. He decided to look upon the face of this mortal who had so disturbed the peace of Olympus. After all, he reasoned, he should see the target of his mother's wrath before delivering her punishment. It was only practical to know what he was dealing with. He alighted on the balcony outside Psyche's chambers as silently as moonlight touching water. The doors were open to catch the morning breeze, and he could see her sleeping form outlined. Beneath covers of silk so fine they seemed woven from mist, he moved closer, his immortal feet making no sound on the marble floor, his bow held ready, an arrow already nocked and waiting dot, and then he saw her face. The stories, the legends, the worship of mortals, none of it had prepared him for the reality of Psyche's beauty. It was not simply a matter of perfectly proportioned features or flawless skin, though she possessed both in abundance. It was something deeper, something that seemed to radiate from within her like light from a flame that burned without consuming. Her face in sleep held an innocence that made his heart clench with unfamiliar emotion, and yet there was a strength in the line of her jaw, a complexity in the slight furrow of her brow that suggested depths of character that no amount of surface beauty could capture. Her hair spread across the pillow like spilled honey, catching the early morning light and holding it. Her lips were slightly parted, as if she were about to speak some word that could change the world. Her breathing was so soft and regular that it seemed to match the rhythm of the universe itself. And there was something else, something that made Eros forget entirely about his mission, his mother's commands, and the arrow that was supposed to seal this sleeping beauty's fate. She was lonely, even in sleep, even relaxed and peaceful. There was a quality of solitude about her that spoke directly to something in Eros's immortal heart. He had spent centuries watching mortals fall in love, had seen every variety of passion, from the noble to the ridiculous, but he had never felt the emotion himself. Love was his weapon, his tool, his gift to bestow on others, but never something he experienced personally. Now, looking down at this mortal girl, whose beauty had started a war between earth and heaven, he felt something stirring in his chest that was entirely new and entirely terrifying. The arrow in his hand began to tremble. Eros tried to steady his aim, to remember his duty and his mother's explicit instructions. Psyche needed to be punished for her presumption. The order of things required it. He drew back the string of his bow, feeling the familiar tension that had launched 1,000 love affairs, and prepared to release the shot that would bind this beautiful girl to some hideous monster. But as he did so, something went wrong. Perhaps it was the way the morning light caught her eyelashes, or the small sound she made as she shifted in her sleep, or simply the overwhelming realization of what he was about to destroy. His hand slipped, the arrow grazed his own finger, and in that instant, The god of love fell victim to his own power. The sensation was unlike anything in his immortal experience. It started as a warmth in his chest, like sunlight focused through crystal, and then spread through his entire being until he felt as if he were burning from within. His knees grew weak, his breath came in short gasps, and his immortal heart began to beat with a rhythm that seemed to match the breathing of the sleeping girl before him. He looked at Psyche and saw not just beauty, but the other half of his own soul, the missing piece that he had never known he was searching for. The arrow fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering on the marble floor with a sound like broken dreams. Eros staggered backward, his wings suddenly unable to support him, his mind reeling with the implications of what had just happened. He was in love, completely, hopelessly, eternally in love with the very mortal he had been set to destroy. And then Psyche opened her eyes. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they looked at each other across the space of the room. Her eyes, the color of violets at dusk, widened as she took in the sight of the winged figure standing in her chambers. But there was no fear in her gaze, only a wondering recognition, as if she too felt the invisible threads that were weaving themselves between their souls. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice carrying the sound of morning dew falling on rose petals. Eros could not answer. His throat had closed with emotions too powerful for words. Instead, he spread his wings and fled, soaring through the open doors and up into the sky like a comet burning backward through the heavens. He left behind only the faint scent of ambrosia and the echo of divine presence, but he carried with him a love that would soon shake the very foundations of Olympus. Psyche sat up in her bed, her heart racing with an excitement she could not name. She moved to the balcony where the strange, beautiful visitor had stood, and found there a single golden feather that seemed to hold the warmth of the sun itself. She pressed it to her chest and felt a longing so acute it was almost painful, a sense that something crucial had just entered her life and then vanished before she could understand what it meant. Meanwhile, Eros flew through the clouds in a state of complete confusion. He could not return to Olympus, not yet, not until he had processed what had happened to him. Instead, he found himself drawn to a hidden cave in the mountains of Crete, a place where the earth spirits had carved chambers from living rock and furnished them with crystals that caught and reflected light in patterns too beautiful for mortal eyes to safely behold. There, in the depths of the mountain, the god of love sat with his head in his hands and tried to understand how his entire existence had been transformed in a single moment. He had always been the one who created love in others, who watched from divine detachment as mortals struggled with the emotions he so casually bestowed. Now he was experiencing those same overwhelming feelings himself, and he finally understood why mortals spoke of love as both the greatest blessing and the most exquisite torture. Days passed. On Olympus, Aphrodite waited for reports of her sons. Success, expecting to hear amusing stories of Psyche's disgrace and the restoration of proper order to the cosmic hierarchy. When no such news arrived, she began to grow impatient. When days turned to weeks with no word from Eros, her impatience turned to anger, and her anger to suspicion. She sent her sparrows to search for her missing son, and they returned with strange reports. Eros had been seen in a mountain cave, but he was not celebrating a successful mission. Instead, he sat in solitude, his bow and arrows untouched, his face bearing an expression of such profound longing that even the birds felt moved to pity. When Aphrodite heard these reports, a terrible suspicion began to form in her divine mind. Down in the mortal realm, Psyche's life had taken a decidedly strange turn. The brief encounter with the winged figure had left her changed in ways she could not articulate. She found herself distracted during the day, staring out to sea as if expecting someone to emerge from the horizon. At night, she would dream of golden wings and eyes that held depths of eternity, waking with tears on her cheeks and an emptiness in her heart that no amount of mortal comfort could fill. More troubling still, her legendary beauty seemed to be having an increasingly isolating effect. Suitors who had once been merely intimidated by her appearance now seemed almost afraid to approach her. There were whispers in the palace that she was cursed, that the gods themselves had marked her as untouchable. Her father consulted oracle after oracle, each giving more disturbing advice than the last. It was the oracle at Delphi who finally delivered the prophecy that would change everything. King Anatole had traveled there in desperation, bringing offerings of gold and precious stones, begging for guidance about his daughter's strange fate. The Pythia, speaking in the voice of Apollo himself, delivered words that would haunt the king for the rest of his days. The girl shall never marry mortal man. She is destined for a creature more terrible than any dragon, whose power extends over gods and mortals alike. Dress her as for a funeral. Take her to the highest peak of the mountain and leave her there to meet her fate. Do not look back, do not weep for her destiny is already written in the stars themselves. The king returned home with a heart as heavy as lead. How could he tell his beloved daughter that the gods themselves had decreed she must die? How could he explain that her beauty, the gift that should have brought her happiness, had instead marked her for sacrifice to some unknown monster? But Psyche, when she heard the oracle's words, received them with a strange sense of relief. For weeks she had felt as if she were waiting for something, as if her life were merely a prelude to some greater purpose. The prophecy, terrifying as it was, at least gave shape to the formless longing that had been consuming her since that morning when she had awakened to find a golden feather on her balcony. "Father," she said, taking his weathered hands in her smooth ones, "do not grieve for me. If this is my fate, then perhaps it is also my freedom. I have never felt as if I belonged in this world with its worship and its isolation. Maybe what awaits me on the mountain is not death, but the beginning of the life I was always meant to live." The preparation for Psyche's journey to the mountain was like organizing a funeral for someone who was still alive. The entire kingdom mourned as if their princess were already dead. Servants wept as they dressed her in the black robes prescribed by the oracle, their tears falling like rain on the marble floors. The queen fainted when she saw her daughter in funeral attire and had to be carried to her chambers by her ladies-in-waiting. But Psyche herself remained strangely serene throughout the preparations. She moved through the palace like a sleepwalker, her mind already somewhere else, her heart pulled toward the mountain by invisible strings. She spoke kindly to the servants, comforted her weeping sisters, and held her mother's hand while the older woman sobbed into her silk pillows. On the appointed day, a procession formed that would have been magnificent if it had not been so heartbreaking. The king walked at the front, his crown sitting heavily on his gray head, his royal robes trailing in the dust of the road. Behind him came Psyche, carried on a litter draped in black silk, her face hidden behind a veil of mourning. The entire court followed, along with citizens of the kingdom who had come to bid farewell to their beloved princess. They climbed the mountain path as the sun reached its zenith, the procession winding up through groves of olive trees and fields of wild lavender. The air grew thin and cold as they ascended, and the sounds of civilization faded behind them until there was nothing but the whisper of wind through pine trees and the distant cry of eagles circling overhead dot at the summit. They found a plateau, a bare rock overlooking valleys that stretched to the horizon. Here, according to the oracle's instructions, they were to leave Psyche to meet her fate. The king's hands shook as he helped his daughter down from the litter, and for a moment his royal composure cracked entirely. "My child," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion, "forgive me. Forgive us all, if there were any other way." Psyche smiled and kissed his cheek, tasting the salt of his tears. "There's nothing to forgive, Father. You have given me a life filled with love, even if it could not be filled with ordinary happiness. Now go, all of you, and do not look back. Whatever comes next, I will face it with the courage you taught me." The procession departed with heavy hearts, their footsteps echoing off the mountain stones like the drumbeat of a dirge. They did not look back as Psyche had requested, but many of them wept openly as they made their way down the mountain path, leaving the princess alone on the windswept peak dot as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Psyche stood at the edge of the precipice and waited. The wind caught her black robes and made them flutter like ravens' wings, and her hair streamed behind her like a banner of gold. She was not afraid, exactly, but she was filled with a sense of standing at the threshold between one life and another, between the world she had always known and something entirely beyond her experience. It was then that she felt it, a warmth in the air that had nothing to do with the dying sunlight. The wind that had been sharp and cold suddenly became gentle, caressing her face with the softness of silk scarves. It lifted her hair and made it dance around her shoulders, and she realized that this was not the ordinary wind of the mountain, but something infused with divine power. Zephyrus, the west wind, had come for her. The gentle god of the evening breeze, had been watching the drama unfold with growing concern. Unlike his brother winds, who delighted in storms and destruction, Zephyrus had always been drawn to beauty and love. He had seen Psyche's loneliness, had felt her longing for something beyond the ordinary world, and when he received his instructions from a source he could not refuse, he carried them out with uncommon tenderness. "Do not be afraid," the wind whispered in her ear, speaking in a voice like rustling leaves. "I am here to carry you to your destiny, but it is not the death that mortals fear. Trust in me, beautiful one, and let me lift you on wings you cannot see." Psyche felt herself rising, her feet leaving the solid rock of the mountain top as gently as if she were stepping into a warm bath. The wind cradled her like invisible hands, supporting her weight and carrying her through the cooling air with a grace that made her feel as if she were dancing with the sky itself. Below her, the mountain fell away, and she found herself soaring over valleys and forests she had never seen, traveling toward a destination she could not imagine. The flight seemed to last both forever and no time at all. Psyche floated through the evening air in a state of dreamy wonder, watching the world spread out beneath her like a living map. She saw shepherds driving their flocks home for the night, their campfires twinkling like earthbound stars. She passed over villages where families gathered for evening meals, their laughter and conversation drifting up to her on the warm currents of air. She flew above forests where night-blooming flowers were beginning to open, releasing fragrances that mixed with the clean scent of mountain air. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Zephyrus began to descend, carrying Psyche toward a valley hidden deep in the mountains, a place that seemed to exist outside the ordinary world. As they drew closer, she could see a palace that took her breath away with its impossible beauty. It was constructed of materials that seemed to capture and reflect light in ways that defied natural law. walls of crystal and silver that glowed with their own inner radiance, towers that rose like spears of captured moonlight toward the star-filled sky. The wind set her down gently in a garden that surrounded the palace, where flowers that bloomed only in dreams grew alongside fountains that sang with voices sweeter than any mortal choir. The air was warm and still, perfumed with jasmine and roses, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of lutes, playing melodies that seemed to speak directly to her heart. As she stood there, overwhelmed by the beauty around her, she became aware of voices speaking near her ear, though she could see no one. They were gentle voices, feminine and kind, and they spoke to her with the warmth of old friends, welcoming her home. "Welcome, dear lady," one voice said. "We have been expecting you." "Come," said another, "let us help you. You must be tired from your journey." "And hungry," added a third. "We have prepared such a feast for you." Invisible hands began to guide her toward the palace, gentle touches on her arms and back that led her through gardens more beautiful than any earthly paradise. The voices continued to speak, telling her that they were her servants, that everything she could see was now hers, that she had come to the place where she truly belonged. "But who are you?" Psyche asked, her voice echoing strangely in the crystal corridors of the palace. "And where am I?" The oracle spoke of a terrible monster, but I see only beauty here. The voices laughed, a sound like silver bells chiming in a gentle breeze. "We are spirits of this place," one explained. "As for where you are, that is not easily answered. You are in the realm between mortal and divine, in a palace built from dreams and starlight. As for the monster the oracle spoke of, perhaps that is a question better left for another time." They led her to chambers that seemed designed specifically for her, furnished with silks and precious metals, with mirrors that reflected not just her appearance, but somehow her very essence. The invisible servants bathed her in water that smelled of roses and felt like liquid moonlight, dressed her in robes that seemed woven from captured sunset, and adorned her hair with flowers that never wilted. Then they brought her to a dining hall where a feast had been prepared that exceeded anything she had ever imagined. There were fruits that tasted like concentrated sunlight, wines that carried the essence of summer evenings, breads that seemed to have been baked in ovens fueled by divine fire. Music played from no visible source, creating harmonies that made her heart soar with inexplicable joy. But despite the incredible luxury surrounding her, Psyche found herself looking around the empty room with growing curiosity. "Will I always dine alone?" she asked. "Surely someone else lives in this palace." The invisible voices exchanged what seemed like meaningful glances she could not see. "There is someone," one finally said. He will come to you tonight after. The sun has set and the stars have taken their places in the sky. He is your husband, my husband. Psyche's heart began to race. But I have never married. I have never even been properly courted. Nevertheless, the voice continued gently, it has been arranged. He loves you deeply, more than you can possibly imagine, and he has prepared all of this for you. But there is one condition, dear lady, one rule that must not be broken. Psyche set down her golden goblet and listened with growing apprehension. You must never try to see his face, the voice said solemnly. He will come to you only in darkness, and you must never light a lamp or candle in his presence. If you look upon him, if you see who he truly is, then all of this will vanish, and you will lose him forever. The condition was so strange, so seemingly arbitrary, that Psyche's mind immediately began to question it. What kind of husband would demand such a thing? What could he possibly be hiding that required such extreme secrecy? But even as her rational mind raised these concerns, she felt a flutter of anticipation in her chest, a memory of golden wings and eyes that held depths of eternity. I understand, she said finally, though she was not sure she understood anything at all. As night fell over the hidden valley, Psyche found herself in her bedchamber, waiting with a mixture of excitement and terror for the arrival of this mysterious husband. The room was lit only by starlight streaming through crystal windows, casting patterns of silver and shadow on the silk-draped walls. She wore a gown of the finest linen, so sheer it seemed made of moonbeams, and her hair fell loose around her shoulders like a cascade of liquid gold. She did not have long to wait. She heard him before she saw him, the soft sound of footsteps that seemed to make no impression on the marble floor, the whisper of movement that suggested someone both graceful and powerful. Then he was there in the room with her, a presence she could feel rather than see, someone whose very existence seemed to change the quality of the air around him. Psyche, he said, and his voice was like music made audible, like the sound of weaned through temple bells. My beloved, my heart, my soul, you came to me. She turned toward the sound, and though she could not see him clearly in the darkness, she could sense his form, tall and strong and graceful beyond mortal ability. When he reached out to touch her face, his fingers were warm and gentle, tracing the line of her cheek with a reverence that made her heart stop. I have waited so long for you, he whispered, longer than you can imagine. You are everything I dreamed you would be, and more than I dared to hope. His touch was electric, sending waves of sensation through her entire being. When he kissed her, it was with a passion that seemed to ignite her very soul, and she found herself responding with an intensity that surprised her. She had never been in love before, had never even been kissed, But something about this mysterious stranger felt absolutely right, as if she had been created specifically for this moment, for this connection. They made love with a tenderness and passion that transcended the physical, their souls joining in ways that made the darkness around them irrelevant. He whispered endearments in her ear, words of love so beautiful they seemed to be poetry written by the gods themselves. She ran her hands over his form in the darkness and found him to be perfectly made, with skin like warm silk and muscles that suggested both strength and grace. Afterward, as they lay entwined on sheets that felt like clouds, he spoke to her of love in ways that made her understand why poets had spent centuries trying to capture such feelings in verse. He told her that she was his other half, the missing piece of his soul, that he had searched for her across eternity and would love her beyond the end of time itself. "But why can I not see you?" she asked, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "If you love me as you say, why must you remain hidden?" His body tensed beneath her touch, and she felt a sadness emanate from him that was almost palpable. "Because, my beloved, there are forces in this world that would separate us if they knew of our love. Your safety and mine depends on secrecy. Trust me, Psyche. Trust that what we have is worth protecting, even if it means accepting mysteries you cannot yet understand." And so began the strangest marriage in the history of mortals and gods. By day, Psyche lived in the crystal palace like a queen, attended by invisible servants who anticipated her every need. She explored gardens that seemed to rearrange themselves for her pleasure, swam in pools that reflected not the sky above, but images of distant places she had never seen, and dined on foods that tasted like concentrated joy. But it was the nights she lived for, when her mysterious husband would come to her in darkness, and they would share a love that seemed to transcend the boundaries between mortal and divine. He would tell her stories of distant lands and ancient times, would sing to her in languages that had been old when the world was young, would make love to her with a passion that left her breathless and wondering if she had somehow died and been transported to the realm of the blessed. Weeks turned to months in this strange paradise, and Psyche found herself settling into a rhythm of contentment she had never imagined possible. Her mysterious husband was everything she could have asked for in a companion: intelligent, funny, passionate, and devoted to her happiness. He would arrive each evening as the first stars appeared, bringing with him stories and laughter and a love so complete it filled every corner of her heart. But like all seemingly perfect situations, this one carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. No matter how happy Psyche was, no matter how fulfilled she felt in her husband's arms, she could not entirely silence the questions that whispered in the back of her mind during the long, solitary days. What did he look like? Why was secrecy so important? And perhaps most troubling of all, what kind of being possessed the power to create such a palace, such servants, such impossible beauty? The invisible voices that attended her seemed to sense her growing curiosity. They would distract her with new diversions, with trips to parts of the palace she had not yet explored, with entertainments designed to occupy her mind. But the questions persisted, growing stronger each day like weeds that could not be pulled from fertile soil. It was during one of these periods of restless wondering that disaster arrived in the form of concern from the outside world. Psyche's sisters, Egil and Chloe, had spent months mourning what they believed to be their sister's death. They had made pilgrimages to the mountain where she had been left for the monster, had wept over the empty plateau where they imagined. Her bones might lie bleaching in the sun, but on this particular day, as they climbed the familiar path to make another offering to their sister's memory, they heard something that made their hearts nearly stop with shock and hope. Floating down from the hidden valley beyond the mountain came the sound of laughter, musical and bright and achingly familiar. It was Psyche's laugh, unmistakable and very much alive. Now, here's where the story takes a turn that might make you shake your head at human nature, because instead of pure joy at discovering their sister was alive, Egil and Chloe felt something much more complicated stirring in their hearts. They were relieved, certainly, but they were also consumed with curiosity and, if we're being honest, a touch of that green-eyed monster that makes family dynamics so wonderfully complex. You see, while they had been in mourning, wearing black, and weeping prettily into their silk handkerchiefs, Psyche had apparently been living in some kind of paradise. The sound of her laughter suggested not survival, but happiness. Not mere existence, but joy. And like sisters throughout history who suddenly discover that their sibling has stumbled into good fortune while they have been struggling with ordinary problems, they felt a mixture of emotions that was not entirely noble. Zephyrus, who had been keeping watch over the valley by divine command, felt their presence on the mountain and found himself in a difficult position. His instructions had been to keep Psyche's location secret, but these were her sisters, and their love for her, however complicated by other emotions, was genuine. After a moment of divine deliberation that lasted about as long as it takes a hummingbird to consider which flower to visit next, he decided that compassion outweighed secrecy. The west wind lifted the two sisters with the same gentleness he had shown Psyche, carrying them down into the hidden valley and setting them in the crystal gardens where their sister waited. The reunion was everything you might expect from a family that had believed one of their members was dead. Tears, embraces, exclamations of wonder, and a flood of questions that would have challenged even the wisest oracle. Psyche, Chloe cried. her voice breaking with emotion as she threw her arms around her youngest sister. "We thought you were dead. We've been mourning you for months. How are you here?" Egil demanded, her practical mind immediately trying to make sense of the impossible beauty surrounding them. "Where is the monster the oracle spoke of? What is this place?" Psyche found herself in the peculiar position of trying to explain a situation she herself did not fully understand. How could she tell her sisters that she was married to someone she had never seen? How could she describe a love so perfect it required complete faith in the absence of sight? The whole thing sounded mad even to her, and she was living it. "I am safe," she said finally, leading them through gardens that made her sisters gasp with amazement. "More than safe. I am happy, happier than I have ever been in my life." But as she showed them through the palace, as they dined on the miraculous feast prepared by invisible servants, as she tried to convey the wonder of her new existence, Psyche became increasingly aware of the skeptical looks her sisters exchanged when they thought she wasn't watching. They were impressed by the luxury, certainly, awed by the impossible beauty of everything around them, but their expressions carried an undercurrent of doubt that made her feel suddenly defensive. "But surely you have seen your husband," Egil said as they reclined on couches that seemed carved from single pieces of ivory. "Surely you know what he looks like." Psyche felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He comes to me only at night. He prefers darkness." The sisters exchanged another look, this one loaded with meaning that Psyche couldn't quite interpret, but found deeply unsettling. "Sister," Chloe said gently, reaching across to take Psyche's hand, "does that not seem strange to you? What kind of husband hides from his wife? What kind of man demands such secrecy?" These were exactly the questions Psyche had been trying not to ask herself, and hearing them voiced by her sisters made them impossible to ignore. She felt a flutter of unease. In her stomach, the first crack in the perfect contentment she had built around herself like armor. "He loves me," she said, but her voice carried less certainty than it had moments before. "He loves me more than life itself. He tells me so every night." "Words are easy," Egil said, her tone carrying the practical cynicism of someone who had dealt with many suitors and learned to question their motivations. "Actions reveal truth, and the action of hiding suggests something that cannot bear examination." Now you might think the sisters were being cruel, poking at their sister's happiness with questions designed to undermine her faith. But they were genuinely concerned, and their concerns were not entirely unreasonable. From their perspective, Psyche had vanished, presumably to die, and now they found her living in luxury with a husband she had never seen, accepting a situation that would have made any reasonable person suspicious. But there was something else at work here too, something that even the sisters themselves might not have fully recognized. Seeing Psyche in this paradise, surrounded by beauty that exceeded anything in the mortal world, married to someone whose very mystery suggested power beyond imagining, they could not help but feel a stab of envy. Their own marriages to perfectly respectable princes who brought them reasonable happiness and acceptable security suddenly seemed very ordinary indeed. Think about it logically, Chloe continued, warming to her theme. The oracle said you were destined for a monster more terrible than any dragon. You were taken to the mountain to die, and instead you find yourself here with a husband who refuses to let you see him. Does it not seem possible that the oracle was correct, that you are indeed married to some hideous creature who knows that one glimpse of his true form would send you screaming into the night? The words hit Psyche like cold water thrown on a warm dreamer. She had been so caught up in the romance of her situation, so overwhelmed by the intensity of her husband's love and the beauty of her surroundings, that she had managed to push aside the obvious questions. But now, faced with her sister's logic, she could not deny that their concerns had merit. But he is so gentle, she whispered, more to herself than to them. So kind and loving, surely no monster could. The most dangerous predators are often the most charming, Egil said softly. Sister, we love you. We do not want to see you hurt, but you must face the possibility that you are being deceived, that this luxury is a trap designed to keep you compliant while some hideous being uses you for his own purposes. The sisters spent 3 days in the Crystal Palace, and with each passing hour their questions grew more pointed and Psyche's confidence more shaken. They pointed out inconsistencies in her situation, asked probing questions about her husband's nature, and gradually planted seeds of doubt that began to grow like thorns in the garden of her happiness. On the final night of their visit, as Psyche prepared for her husband's arrival with more anxiety than she had felt since her first night, in the palace, Chloe made a suggestion that would change everything. Sister, she said, pressing something small and hard into Psyche's palm, if you truly want to know the truth about your situation, if you want to be certain that your husband is what he claims to be, take this. Psyche looked down to find a small oil lamp in her hand, its bronze surface warm from her sister's touch. Light it when he sleeps, Chloe continued. Look upon his face. If he is truly the loving husband he claims to be, then he will understand your need to see him. If he is something else. She pressed something else into Psyche's other hand, and Psyche felt the cold touch of metal against her palm. Then you will need this knife to defend yourself. After her sisters departed the next morning, carried away by Zephyrus with promises to keep Psyche's secret, the palace felt different. The crystal walls that had seemed to glow with inner light now appeared somehow cold and distant. The invisible servants continued to attend her needs, but their voices seemed to carry undertones she had not noticed before. Even the gardens, with their impossible flowers and singing fountains, felt less magical and more like an elaborate prison designed to keep her from asking inconvenient questions. That evening, as she prepared for her husband's arrival, Psyche found herself studying every shadow in her bedchamber with new eyes. She had hidden the lamp and knife where she could reach them easily, and now she waited with her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard throughout the palace. Came to her as he always did, materializing from the darkness like a dream made flesh. His touch was as gentle as ever, his voice as musical, his love as passionate and all-consuming. They made love with the same intensity that had marked all their nights together. But this time Psyche found herself cataloging sensations differently, trying to glean clues about his true nature from the feel of his skin, the sound of his breathing, the weight of his body against hers. He seemed no different than he had on any other night. His skin was smooth and warm, his form perfectly proportioned, his movements graceful and assured. If he was a monster, he was unlike any creature she had ever imagined. But her sister's words echoed in her mind, and she could not shake the feeling that she was being deliberately deceived. When his breathing finally deepened into the rhythm of sleep, when she was certain he would not wake, Psyche carefully extracted herself from his embrace and felt in the darkness for the lamp she had hidden nearby. Her hand shook as she struck the flint, as she lit the wick, as she slowly raised the lamp to cast its golden light across the face of her mysterious husband. What she saw in that flickering light changed everything she thought she knew about love, about herself, and about the very nature of reality. The face revealed by the lamplight was not that of a monster. It was the most beautiful face she had ever seen, so perfect it seemed carved by divine hands from living marble touched by sunlight. His features were flawless, with high cheekbones that caught the light and shadows in ways that made her heart ache with their beauty. His hair was golden as wheat in summer fields, curling softly around a face that seemed to glow with its own inner radiance, and folded against his back, clearly visible in the lamp's glow, were wings of white and gold that could only belong to a god. This was no monster. This was Eros himself, the god of love, son of Aphrodite, one of the most powerful beings in the pantheon of Olympus. He was beautiful beyond mortal comprehension, and he was her husband. Psyche stared in wonder and growing understanding. The secrecy, the invisible servants, the impossible palace, it all made sense now. She was married to a god, living in a realm between mortal and divine. loved by the very personification of love itself. The oracle had been both right and wrong. She was indeed wed to a being more powerful than any dragon, but instead of a monster, she had found divinity itself. As she gazed at his sleeping face, drinking in details she had only been able to imagine, Psyche felt a love so overwhelming. It brought tears to her eyes. This beautiful god had chosen her, had defied whatever cosmic forces had tried to keep them apart, had created this paradise specifically for her happiness. How could she have doubted him? How could she have listened to her sister's fears when the truth was so much more wonderful than anything they could have imagined? But even as these thoughts filled her mind with joy and wonder, disaster struck in the form of a single drop of hot oil that fell from the lamp onto Eros's shoulder. God awoke instantly, his eyes opening to reveal depths of hurt and betrayal that cut through Psyche's soul like the sharpest blade. For a moment that seemed suspended outside of time, they looked at each other in the lamplight, she with wonder and love and growing horror at what she had done, he with a pain so profound it seemed to dim the very light around them. "Psyche," he whispered, and his voice carried the sound of dreams shattering. "Oh, my beloved, what have you done?" She dropped the lamp, which shattered on the marble floor, spilling oil that burst into flames that cast dancing shadows on the crystal walls. "I'm sorry," she gasped, reaching for him even as he sat up and spread his magnificent wings. "I'm so sorry. I love you. I love you more than life itself. Please, let me explain." But Eros was already rising from the bed, his face a mask of divine sorrow. "Love cannot exist without trust," he said, his words falling like stones into still water. "You have chosen doubt over faith, suspicion over love. You have broken the one condition that could have kept us together." "No!" Psyche cried, scrambling to her feet and reaching for him desperately. "Please don't leave me. I was weak, I was foolish, but I love you. Doesn't that matter? Doesn't our love mean anything?" For a moment his expression softened, and she saw in his eyes the same love that had filled their nights together. "Our love means everything," he said quietly. "That is precisely why this betrayal cuts so deeply. You have wounded not just me, but love itself." And with those words he spread his wings and rose toward the crystal ceiling, which opened like flower petals to let him pass. As he disappeared into the star-filled sky, taking with him the light that had made the palace glow, Psyche heard his voice echo one final time through the chambers that had been their paradise. "When you can prove that love is stronger than doubt, when you can show that faith means more to you than sight, then perhaps we can be together again. But until that day you are banished from this place, condemned to wander the mortal world until you learn what love truly means." The palace around her began to dissolve like mist before sunrise. The crystal walls became transparent, then invisible, then gone entirely. The singing fountains fell silent. The impossible flowers withered. The invisible servants vanished without so much as a whispered goodbye. Psyche found herself standing alone on a barren mountainside in her thin nightgown, with nothing but memories to prove that any of it had ever been real. She fell to her knees on the rocky ground and wept until no more tears would come. Her cries, echoing off the stone cliffs, like the laments of all lovers who had ever lost what they treasured most through their own actions. The wind was cold and sharp, cutting through her thin garment and making her shiver, but the chill in her heart was far worse than any physical discomfort. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded her painfully of her husband's wings, Psyche rose to her feet and began the long journey back to the world of mortals. She had lost everything: her home, her family's trust, her divine husband, and the paradise they had shared. But she had also gained something, though she did not yet recognize it as a gift. She now knew exactly what she had to fight for, and exactly how much it meant to her. The journey down the mountain was treacherous for someone wearing nothing but a silk nightgown and soft slippers, designed for palace floors rather than rocky paths. Psyche's feet were soon cut and bleeding, her delicate garment torn by thorns and rough stone. But these physical dips seemed trivial compared to the ache in her heart, the constant awareness of everything she had lost through her moment of weakness. She made her way through forests, where wild animals watched her with curious eyes, across streams that soaked her already inadequate clothing, over hills that seemed to stretch endlessly toward a horizon that promised no comfort. She ate berries when she could find them, drank from clear streams, and slept in whatever shelter she could find, always haunted by dreams of golden wings and a love that had been perfect until she destroyed it. It was during this period of wandering that Psyche began to understand something crucial about the nature of love and loss. In the palace, surrounded by luxury and divine attention, love had seemed easy, natural, inevitable. But now, deprived of everything except the memory of what she had experienced, she realized that real love was not about ease or comfort or even happiness. Real love was about choice, about deciding that someone was worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible, about proving devotion not through words, but through actions that required genuine sacrifice. After weeks of aimless wandering, weeks of surviving on scraps and sleeping under stars that seemed to mock her with their beauty, Psyche made a decision that would have seemed impossible to the pampered princess she had once been. She would find Aphrodite the goddess whose son she had married without permission, whose anger had probably caused this entire situation. She would throw herself on the mercy of the goddess of love and beg for a chance to win back her husband. It was not a plan born of hope. Exactly. Psyche knew enough about the gods to understand that divine mercy was rarely given freely, that Aphrodite in particular was known for her jealousy and her creative punishments. But desperation had given her a clarity that comfort never could. She would rather die trying to win back Eros and live the rest of her mortal life knowing she had simply given up Dot. The search for Aphrodite led Psyche on a journey across the ancient Mediterranean world. She visited temple after temple, making offerings with whatever small coins she could earn by doing menial labor in the towns she passed through. She worked in taverns and markets, her divine beauty now hidden under layers of dust and exhaustion, her soft hands growing calloused from work she had never imagined herself capable of performing. Everywhere she went, she asked about Aphrodite, seeking the goddess's most sacred shrines, the places where her presence was strongest. Temple priests looked at this ragged young woman with a mixture of pity and suspicion, wondering what crime she must have committed to be seeking divine intervention so desperately. But something in her eyes, some depth of sincere devotion mixed with absolute determination, made them take her seriously enough to point her toward the next shrine. The next possibility, Dot, it was in a temple on the island of Cyprus, Aphrodite's most sacred place, that Psyche finally found what she was looking for. She had worked for months to earn passage to the island, scrubbing floors and carrying water for a ship captain who took pity on her obvious desperation. When she finally stood before the great temple of Aphrodite, its marble columns gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, she felt a mixture of terror and relief that nearly brought her to her knees. The temple was magnificent in a way that seemed designed to humble mortals, its proportions so perfect they seemed to have been conceived by divine mathematics. Inside, the air was thick with incense and the whispered prayers of suppliants, while statues of the goddess in various poses lined the walls, like a gallery of divine beauty. At the center of it all stood the most famous statue of Aphrodite in the ancient world, carved from marble so fine it seemed almost alive, so realistic that many visitors swore they could see it breathing. Psyche approached the altar on trembling legs, her torn dress and exhausted appearance marking her immediately as someone in desperate circumstances. Other worshippers moved aside as she passed, some with expressions of sympathy, others with a distaste of the comfortable for those who reminded them, too, starkly of how quickly fortune could change. She knelt before the altar and began to pray, with an intensity that soon attracted the attention of everyone in the temple. Her words were not the formal phrases typically offered to the gods, but a raw, honest plea that came straight from her wounded heart. "Great Aphrodite," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying somehow to every corner of the sacred space. "Goddess of love, mother of Eros, I have come to throw myself upon your mercy. I have loved your son and lost him through my own foolishness. I have wandered the world in search of a way to prove that my love is real, that it is worth preserving. I offer myself to you completely. Do with me what you will. Punish me, however you see fit, but please, I beg you, give me a chance to earn back what I have lost." The response was immediate and terrifying. The air in the temple suddenly grew thick and electric, charged with divine presence in a way that made every mortal hair stand on end. The flames on the altar leaped higher, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. And then, materializing from light and sea foam and the very essence of desire itself, Aphrodite appeared. The goddess was everything the legends claimed and more. Her beauty was not merely physical, but metaphysical, a perfection that seemed to reach into the viewer's soul and rearrange it to better appreciate divine aesthetics. Her hair flowed like liquid gold touched by sunlight. Her skin had the luminous quality of pearls found in the deepest ocean trenches, and her eyes held depths that seemed to contain every love story ever lived. But there was nothing kind in those beautiful eyes as they fixed on the kneeling mortal woman. Aphrodite's expression was one of cold fury, barely held in check. The anger of a goddess who had been challenged and was now faced with the source of her humiliation. "So," the goddess said, her voice carrying the sound of waves breaking against hidden rocks, "the little mortal who dared to steal the worship that belonged to me has finally come crawling back. The girl who thought herself beautiful enough to rival a goddess now kneels in rags before my altar." Psyche kept her eyes fixed on the marble floor, not daring to meet the goddess's gaze directly. "Great goddess, I never meant to challenge you. I never asked for the worship of mortals. I only wanted to love and be loved in return." Aphrodite laughed a sound like silver bells chiming in a winter storm. "Love? You speak to me of love? You, who destroyed the happiness of my own son through your suspicion and betrayal. You, who could not trust the gift you were given, and instead chose to satisfy your curiosity like a child poking at a sleeping serpent." The words cut deep because they were true. Psyche had indeed destroyed her own happiness, had chosen doubt over faith at the crucial moment. But her suffering had taught her something about the difference between the easy love of fairy tales and the hard one, love that could survive real challenges. "You are right, goddess," she said, her voice steady, despite her terror. I failed the test of faith. I chose sight over trust, curiosity over devotion. But I have learned from my mistake. I have wandered the world and discovered what love truly means. Now I ask not for forgiveness, but for the chance to prove that I have become worthy of what I lost. Aphrodite studied the kneeling mortal with the calculating gaze of a general planning a particularly complex battle. Here was an opportunity for the kind of poetic justice that the gods so enjoyed. This presumptuous little mortal wanted a chance to prove herself. Very well, she would be given that chance, but the tasks set before her would be so impossible, so designed to highlight her mortal limitations, that her inevitable failure would serve as entertainment for Olympus and a warning to other mortals, who might think themselves capable of challenging divine authority. Very well, the goddess said, her smile beautiful and terrible. You speak of proving yourself? Then prove yourself you shall. I will give you 3 tasks, each more difficult than the last. If you can complete all 3, then perhaps we can discuss your future with my son. But when you fail, as you inevitably will, you will accept whatever punishment I decree without complaint. Psyche raised her head and looked directly into the goddess's eyes for the first time, her own gaze steady and unafraid. I accept your terms, great Aphrodite. What would you have me do? The goddess gestured, and suddenly they were no longer in the temple, but in a vast warehouse that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. The air was thick with dust and the earthy smell of grain, and everywhere Psyche looked, she saw mountains of seeds. Wheat, barley, millet, poppy seeds, lentils, and chickpeas, all mixed together in enormous piles that reached toward the ceiling like small mountains. Your first task, Aphrodite said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space, is to sort all of these seeds by type before sunrise tomorrow. Every grain must be in its proper pile, every seed in its designated place. Miss even one, allow even a single poppy seed to remain mixed with the wheat, and you fail. Psyche looked around at the impossible task before her. There were millions upon millions of seeds, enough to keep an army of workers busy for months. To sort them all in a single night was beyond human capability, and she was certain that was precisely the point. This was not a test designed to measure her devotion or her character, but a trap designed to demonstrate her inevitable failure. But she had not come this far to give up at the first obstacle. She walked to the nearest pile and began to work, picking up individual seeds and examining them in the dim light, trying to identify their type and sort them into separate groups. Her fingers moved as quickly as she could manage, but after an hour of intense effort, she had barely made a dent in even the smallest pile dot. As the day wore on and exhaustion began to cloud her vision. Psyche realized that traditional human effort would never be enough. She needed help, but from where? Aphrodite had clearly designed this task to be impossible for a mortal working alone, but perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the real test was not her ability to accomplish the impossible through brute force, but her willingness to humble herself and ask for assistance. She knelt among the scattered seeds and spoke aloud, not knowing if anyone could hear her, but hoping that somewhere in the vast cosmos there might be beings who understood what it meant to love someone enough to attempt the impossible. I'd call upon any who might have pity on a mortal woman who has lost everything through her own fault, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the dusty air. I do not ask for this task to be completed for me, but for the help I need to complete it myself. I have learned that love is not about pride or independence, but about knowing when to accept the kindness of others. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Psyche heard a sound like gentle rain beginning to fall, except they were indoors and there were no clouds visible through the high windows. The sound grew closer, and she realized it was the rustling of countless tiny feet, ants, thousands upon thousands of ants, streaming into the warehouse through cracks in the walls and gaps beneath doors. They moved with purpose and organization that spoke of intelligence far beyond what most humans attributed to such small creatures. And as Psyche watched in wonder, they began to sort the seeds with efficiency that would have impressed the most skilled human workers. Each ant seemed to know instinctively which type of seed it was carrying, and they worked together with a coordination that turned the overwhelming task into something manageable. Lines of ants formed conveyor systems, passing seeds from worker to worker until each grain found its proper pile. They worked through the night without rest, their tiny bodies moving in patterns too complex for human minds to fully comprehend. Psyche worked alongside them, her human hands slow and clumsy compared to their precise movements, but her effort clearly appreciated by the insects who had chosen to help her. By dawn, every seed was in its proper place, every grain sorted according to type, the warehouse organized with a precision that would have satisfied the most demanding overseer. When Aphrodite arrived to inspect the work, expecting to find Psyche collapsed in exhaustion beside piles of unsorted seeds, she instead found the mortal woman standing calmly beside perfectly organized mountains of grain. The goddess's expression shifted from satisfied anticipation to surprised anger as she realized her first trap had been overcome. Clever, Aphrodite said coldly, but cleverness will not help you with your second task. Once again the world shifted around them, and Psyche found herself standing beside a river that flowed with water so clear it seemed like liquid crystal. On the far bank, she could see sheep grazing in meadows that seemed to glow with their own inner light. But these were not ordinary sheep. Their wool was spun gold, literally golden fleece that caught the sunlight and reflected it in patterns that hurt mortal eyes to look upon directly. The golden ram and his flock, Aphrodite explained with obvious satisfaction. Your task is to gather their fleece and bring it to me. But be warned, these creatures are not gentle farm animals. They are the children of Helios himself, and their tempers burn as hot as the sun that sired them. Many heroes have tried to approach them, and their bones now fertilize the meadows where the sheep graze. Psyche studied the scene before her. The sheep did indeed look dangerous, their eyes glowing with inner fire, their movements too quick and aggressive for normal livestock. Even from this distance, she could feel the heat radiating from their golden wool, and she understood that any direct approach would likely result in her being burned to ash before she could gather so much as a single strand of fleece. But once, again, the real test seemed to be not raw courage or strength, but wisdom and humility. Psyche settled down beside the river bank to think, watching the deadly sheep and trying to understand their nature. They were children of the sun, which meant they would be most active and dangerous during the heat of the day. But what about at night, when their father's chariot had passed beyond the horizon? As evening approached, Psyche noticed that the sheep's behavior began to change. Their aggressive movements slowed, their fiery eyes dimmed, and they settled into what appeared to be normal sleep in the cooling grass. But even more important, she noticed that as they moved through the day, their golden fleece caught on the thorns and branches of the bush where they grazed, leaving behind tufts of precious golden wool. She waited until the moon was high and the sheep were deep in slumber, then waded carefully across the river. The water was shockingly cold, a sharp contrast to the heat that had been radiating from the opposite bank during the day. She moved as quietly as possible, collecting the golden fleece that had been naturally shed, and caught on the vegetation around the grazing area dot. It was delicate work that required infinite patience. Each tuft of wool had to be carefully extracted from thorns without making noise that might wake the sleeping sheep. The fleece itself was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with contained energy, as if each strand held a fragment of sunlight waiting to be released dot by dawn. Psyche had gathered an armful of golden fleece, enough to satisfy even the most demanding goddess. She made her way back across the river just as the sheep were beginning to stir, their eyes once again beginning to glow with the fire of their divine heritage. When Aphrodite saw the golden fleece, her expression grew even colder. Twice now, this insignificant mortal had overcome challenges designed to destroy her. The goddess was beginning to suspect that Psyche was receiving help from sources she had not anticipated, and the possibility that other divine beings might be sympathetic to the mortal's cause was deeply troubling. "Impressive," Aphrodite said, her voice carrying undertones of genuine anger now. "But your final task will test more than cleverness and patience. It will require you to risk the very essence of your being." The world around them dissolved once more, and Psyche found herself standing at the entrance to a cave that seemed to descend into the very depths of the earth. The air that flowed from its depths was cold and carried the scent of things that had never known sunlight, of places where mortal feet were never meant to tread. "This is the entrance to the underworld," Aphrodite said, her beautiful face now a mask of divine cruelty. "Your final task is to descend to the realm of Hades and ask Persephone for a box of her beauty. Tell her it is for me, that I have been worn down by caring for my lovesick son, and need some of her divine radiance to restore my own." Psyche felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. The underworld was the realm of the dead, a place from which no mortal returned. To descend into Hades was to die. And even if she somehow managed to reach Persephone and obtain the requested box, the journey back to the surface was considered impossible for living beings. "This is not a test," she realized aloud. "This is an execution." Aphrodite smiled, and her beauty in that moment was more terrifying than any monster's ugliness. "Perhaps, but it is also your only chance to prove that your love for my son is stronger than your desire to continue breathing. If you truly love Eros as much as you claim, then surely you would risk death itself for the chance to be reunited with him." And there it was, the ultimate test of love. Not a challenge to be overcome through cleverness or patience, but a choice between safety and devotion. As she stood at the entrance to the underworld, Psyche made her choice. Life without Eros was merely existence, and she would rather risk everything than continue in the half-life she had been living since their separation. With resolve strengthening her steps, she began her descent. Along the way, voices whispered guidance, "Carry coins for Charon, bring treats for Cerberus, resist the pleas of the dead." These mysterious helpers, perhaps set by gods who sympathized with her plight, ensured she reached the throne of Persephone herself, the queen of the underworld. Touched by Psyche's devotion, handed her a sealed box. "Take this to Aphrodite, but never open it yourself." As Psyche journeyed back to the surface, curiosity, that same fatal flaw that had cost her everything, began to whisper to her. Wouldn't a touch of divine beauty help her win back Eros? Wasn't that why she had risked everything? Her trembling fingers broke the seal. But instead of beauty, the box contained only darkness, a sleep like death. that dropped her motionless to the ground. It would have been the end, if not for Eros, who had finally recovered from his wound. Feeling Psyche's presence fading from the world, he flew to her, gathering her limp form in his arms. "My beloved," he whispered, brushing the deathly sleep from her eyes. "Even the gods cannot resist what we have found together." When Psyche awoke, she found herself on Mount Olympus, with Eros kneeling beside her and Zeus himself standing before them. The king of gods smiled at their devotion. "Love that survives such trials deserves eternity," Zeus declared. He offered Psyche ambrosia, the food of immortality, transforming her into a goddess worthy of her divine husband. Even Aphrodite, seeing how deeply her son loved this mortal-turned goddess, finally relented. The wedding feast that followed outshone all celebrations before it. And so, dear dreamer, as your eyes grow heavy, remember that true love is not found in perfect conditions, but forged through true trials overcome together. Sleep now, knowing that somewhere Eros and Psyche still embrace, their wings entwined among the stars that watch over your dreams. Their story reminds us that faith, courage, and love can transform even the most impossible circumstances into something eternal and divine.